Cinderella marries into a rich family and suddenly disappears. Mobster's daughter shot dead. Pieces of a headless man's body found at the water's edge. All of this, yet it all points to the same killer, the biggest suspect, who has been arrested multiple times and never convicted for it. What the hell is the reason? The story goes back to 1943. Robert was born to the New York real estate mogul, Seymour Dexter. He was the eldest son of the family and equally, the older brother of Douglas Robert, a business developer. When they were children, they had needed counseling because of the brotherly rivalry, and the counselor had written disturbing comments about the then 10-year-old Robert, saying that he had a broken personality and might even be schizophrenic. The beginning of the breakdown may be traced back to an unfortunate childhood. In the documentary,
Your memories of your time with your mother.
Happy, happy, happy.
unfortunately, at the age of 7, his mom fell from her house and died. Robert says his dad took him to a window so he could see his mother standing on the roof. As he was about to go back to bed, the maid screamed, causing Robert to turn around and witness his mother jump to her death, leaving an indelible shadow on Robert's childhood. But thankfully he found the love of his life, and on April 12, 1973, his birthday, they had a private wedding where 30-year-old Robert married 21-year-old Catherine. Life after marriage was very sweet, but not for long. 3 years later, Catherine was pregnant. Robert, who did not want children, forced Catherine to have an abortion. Catherine, who wanted a child, was of course heartbroken, and the relationship between the two dropped to an icy point. It could be a challenged authority, the after effects of marijuana use, or an affair between the two partners. The couple fights frequently, and Robert cuts off Catherine's credit to control her. One of Catherine's classmates recalled that Catherine was happy to be a medical student and worked hard. She always sat in the front row taking notes. But just a month before Catherine graduated from medical school, misfortune struck again. January 31, 1982 was a Sunday. That afternoon, Catherine drove to her best friend Gilbert's house to attend a party, during which Catherine received a phone call from her husband Robert, who asked Catherine to come home immediately. Good friend Gilbert saw Catherine after receiving the phone, the whole body trembling, showing extreme anxiety. Before leaving, Catherine said to good friend Gilbert, "I have to go. If something happens you must come to see, I'm afraid of him." Gilbert heard this, did not care too much, because he did not know what happened. In order to comfort Catherine, Gilbert agreed. However, he could never have imagined that this would be the last time he would see Catherine. From there, Catherine went missing, and after 4 days to Thursday night, Catherine's husband, Robert, went to the police station to report the incident. He told police that at 3 or 4 p.m. Sunday afternoon, Catherine left her home in South Salem to go to a party at the home of her best friend, Gilbert. At 7:30 p.m. Catherine drove home and appeared to have had a few drinks but was not intoxicated. Not long after Catherine arrived home, the two got into an argument about something. Catherine insisted on going back to her apartment in New York to live alone, and Robert said, "You can go back if you want to, but you can't drive back." So Catherine compromised and decided to take the 9:17 train back to New York. By 8:30 p.m., Robert was driving Catherine to the Katna station. After Catherine boarded the train, Robert drove back to his home. He saw Mr. Neighbor near his home, so he had a drink and a chat with the neighbor, after which Robert went out for a walk alone. At 11:15 p.m., Robert used a payphone on the side of the road and called home to his Manhattan apartment to see if Catherine had arrived home yet. Catherine picked up the phone and said he was watching television, and the door opener at the apartment that night confirmed that Catherine had entered the building during the night and had gone to the penthouse on the 15th floor. After a few days, the medical school that Catherine attended called and said that Catherine hadn't been to class for a few days, and that's when Robert realized that Catherine was missing. After listening to Robert's description, the police thought it was just an ordinary disappearance case. It looked like the couple was in trouble and one of them left home when they were unhappy. They had encountered too many cases like this. Maybe in a few days Catherine would come home, so the police didn't follow up on it. Robert then puts out a reward notice, hoping that someone with information will come forward. Soon the story hit the New York tabloids, and Mr. Robert hired detectives and offered a reward. He tells family, friends, and the police that his wife may have run off with a drug dealer, which her family finds unbelievable since she is only a few months away from graduation. When Catherine's disappearance broke, his best friend Gilbert thought that his disappearance must have something to do with Robert. Because Gilbert clearly remembers the words that Catherine said to her that day when she was leaving, Gilbert felt that she could not count on the police after seeing how irresponsible they were in handling the case. So she gathered a few sisters and drove to Catherine's house in the middle of the night one day. Then a few of them worked together to smuggle all the bags of garbage outside their house into their car and drove it back to Gilbert's house. Then they dumped the entire contents of the trash bags on the ground, which had Catherine's clothes, textbooks, diary, and so on. It looked as if Robert knew that Catherine was never coming back. Then Gilbert and a couple of sisters made a big discovery. They found a note. It had these words written on it: dump, bridge, dig, boat, other, shovel, rental car. The more they looked at the words on the note, the more they thought about it, and the more creeped out they became, because all of these things had to do with dumping a body. To the police, these were also just circumstantial evidence and didn't mean anything. Neighbors with whom Robert claimed to have been drinking that night stated that they had not met Robert at all that night, let alone had a drink. Robert's phone call back to his Manhattan apartment that night was also proven to be false. Robert said he drove Catherine to the train station that night, yet no one could prove it, and the story was a big deal throughout New York at the time. The police investigated to the night of the murder. The Manhattan apartment door opener's statement that Catherine returned to the apartment was not provided by the police, but by Robert's group. In this way, there is a big question mark over whether Catherine actually returned to the Manhattan apartment that night. It turns out that a few days before Catherine disappeared that year, Catherine hired a lawyer to ask Robert for a divorce by mutual consent. This included the division of property. Robert learned of this and refused Catherine's request for divorce. Just 3 days after this, Catherine disappeared. Is it all just a coincidence? Decades later, in an interview with the producers of the documentary, Mr. Durst admitted that most of what he told the police was a lie. Why did he lie? When the police know, they go back to checking. They don't bother me. I'm not used to people questioning my truthfulness. Back in time, during the police investigation into Catherine's disappearance, there was another woman who frequented Rob's side, Susan Berman. This person is a close friend of Robert's. Susan has known Robert since college, and Susan's dad is a mobster in Las Vegas. She and Robert are both Jewish and are very much in sync on the dad-hating front. As a journalist and author, Susan's popularity came from exposing her dad's dark history. In the months leading up to Catherine's disappearance, Susan had been close to Rob and had received 2 cash gifts totaling $50,000. After his wife's disappearance, Susan had served as his spokesperson, helping him avoid the media and providing Rob with an alibi for when Catherine disappeared. Investigators have long suspected that Susan knew his secret, and this Susan does not live in New York today, but in Los Angeles, California. Just as the police are about to travel to Los Angeles to find this Susan and investigate the situation, something unexpected happens. On December 24, 2000, the Los Angeles Police Department in California responded to a 911 call. Someone claimed that the door to a neighbor's house had been left open and that no one was answering when they yelled inside, and wanted the police to come and take a look. The address was 1527 Benedict Canyon, an address that was the home of Robert's longtime best friend, Susan. Shortly after receiving the call, the Los Angeles Beverly Hills Police Department dispatched officers to Susan's home. Police entered the house and found Susan lying face up on the floor, shot in the back of the head at close range. The coroner determined that she had been dead no more than 24 hours and that the murder weapon was a 9mm handgun. The items at the scene were intact with no financial loss and no signs of a struggle. Therefore, the police judged that this case may be an acquaintance of the crime. Not a few days after the incident, bizarre things came. The Beverly Hills Police Department received an anonymous letter with these words: "Body at 1527 Benedict Canyon." The envelope of this letter was addressed only to the Beverly Hills Police, and notably contained a misspelling of the word Beverly, which should have ended in LY instead of LY. Incredibly, judging by the mail truck, the letter was mailed the day before the police found Susan's body. It is therefore highly likely that this letter was sent by the murderer, apparently in an attempt to get the police to discover Susan, who had been killed in her home, as soon as possible. Why would he do this? It looks like the case is again connected to Robert. Robert was in California at the time of the murder. Due to the lack of evidence, the police could not find Susan's murderer and the case became an open one. The media, however, did not let Robert off the hook, and they followed up on Catherine's disappearance as well as Susan's case. Due to Robert's inability to speak well and the death of his spokesperson, Susan, he broke with the family in 1994 when his father chose his brother, Douglas Durst, to take over the family business. Distraught by what had happened, Robert went into hiding. We turn our attention to the state of Texas in the United States. In the southeastern part of Texas, there is a small island called Galveston, which is located 80 kilometers southeast of Houston, right next to Galveston Bay. On the night of September 30, 2001, the Texas police were called to the scene of the discovery of human tissue, and they were immediately dispatched to the scene. After some salvage, they found a total of 20 pieces of human tissue, which was the body of a male. All but the head were recovered, and police found a newspaper in one of the trash bags. It had been soaked for a long time, yet the writing on the newspaper was still legible. There was an address written on it, 2213 K Street, an address in Galveston not far from the scene. So police went to 2213 K Street. It was a rented house. Room 1 was rented to a 71-year-old man named Blake and room 2 was rented to a mute old woman named Senna. The police identified the body found at sea through fingerprints as Blake, who lived in room 1. That's why the mute old woman in room number 2 became the key figure. The police were at the door of room 2 and found a reaction of luminous blood, so they applied to the court for a search warrant. After obtaining the warrant, the police entered room 2 only to see that the house was very simply furnished with very few traces of life, not like a room inhabited by an old woman. There was a bed sheet on the floor of the kitchen, which the police lifted and found several scratches on the mattress. So the police lifted the mat, and indeed found a large amount of blood under the mat. After identification, the bloodstains did belong to Blake, the tenant of room 1. It seems that the murderer split the body in room 2. The police found a receipt from an eye clinic for an appointment to pick up eyeglasses in a garbage can in the backyard, and the signature on the receipt was written as Robert. What wasn't expected was that Robert actually showed up on the day he had an appointment to pick up his glasses. This was caught in the act by the police, who found a tool in Robert's passenger side trunk. This greatly increased his suspicion of the crime, and after police investigation, the mute old woman was impersonated by Robert in drag, and the mute old lady's name was used as the name of a high school classmate of Robert's. Not only that, but he was smart enough to pretend to be the old woman's nephew, who came to visit the old woman on a regular basis, and then the police informed Robert that he would be charged with first-degree murder and that bail would be $250,000. Upon hearing this, Robert said to the police officer, "I really don't have $250,000 on hand right now, but you let me make a phone call." So Robert made a phone call to his second wife Deborah, whom he married in 2000, in New York City. The next day, $250,000 on the account. You know, $250,000 is not a small amount of money. The police at that time directly looked at the blindfolded. Soon the news of Robert's alleged murder was discovered and reported by a New York newspaper, and Robert didn't show up when the first hearing was held, apparently having gotten away with it. Shortly afterward, though, a shaved head Robert was arrested in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, for stealing a sandwich from a Wegmans supermarket. To no one's surprise, police recovered $38,000 in cash from Robert's parked car. He had so much money that he had to steal a sandwich. In addition to the cash, police also found 2 handguns in the car, as well as the victim Blake's driver's license, which apparently became another important piece of evidence in Robert's murder of his neighbor Blake. At this point in time, Robert not only have to deal with the reinvestigation of the disappearance of the year, but also to deal with the allegations of the murder of his neighbor Blake in Texas. Robert spends $1.8 million and hires 2 well-known attorneys to defend himself. In 2003, the Blake murder case went to trial in a Texas court, and Robert was charged with first-degree murder. Robert said that his neighbor Black came to his room and pointed a gun at him in defense and then wrestled with Blake, during which the gun went off and hit Blake. Robert felt very afraid to call the police. Since he was involved in 2 previous cases, no one would believe him if he called the police, so Robert decided to split his body and throw it into the sea. The attorney vocally described Robert's life, speaking of childhood tragedy, of carrying around pictures of his wife for affection, and of suffering from social disorders. These encounters of Robert's made the jury sympathize with him and obviously influenced the jury's decision. The court acquitted the defendant, Robert, of first-degree murder and released him from jail at the end of the day. Robert was later sentenced by the court the following year to 5 years in prison for the crime of parole escape as well as the crime of falsifying evidence. In 2010, a movie called Beautifully Broken was released, which depicted the story of the disappearance of Catherine as well as the shooting of Susan. After the movie was released, the finger was pointed at Robert again, who by this time was out of prison and had seen the movie himself. After this, Robert had an idea. He contacted the director of the movie, Jericho, and Robert wanted Jericho to make a documentary about himself. He wanted to tell the story of what happened and the story behind the movie, and Uretsky was very interested in Robert's experience. He knew Robert very well and always wanted to pursue the truth, whether Robert was a murderer or not. So the director, Uretsky, gladly agreed to Robert's idea of making a documentary. With 20 hours of interviews, the documentary New York Calamity was initiated by HBO for production. During this time, the film crew reorganized the various physical evidence and testimonies of the year. The director put the public's questions over the years through the form of interviews for Robert himself to answer. Robert's answers are rigorous and logical. It seems that you cannot find any loopholes. Robert also in the family heir to lose down and was left out. His brother also hired a bodyguard to guard him, which makes the film crew began to express sympathy for Robert, and even slowly feel that Robert is not guilty. During the filming of the documentary, Susan's ex-husband's son was rearranging Susan's belongings and found an envelope, which had not been turned over to the police at the time, which had been mailed to Susan in Beverly Hills, Los Angeles, back in the day by Durst. After the crew saw the envelope, all of them felt chills as they noticed that the spelling of Beverly on the envelope was wrong. They noticed that Beverly was misspelled on the envelope. The crew immediately thought of the anonymous letter that the police had received that year, and they compared the two letters, realizing that not only did they make the same spelling mistake, but also that their handwriting was very similar. The crew had an internal meeting after they got the clues. During the meeting, they decided to seek justice, dig out the truth, and find as much evidence as possible to provide to the police to bring the murderer to justice. They decided to get Robert to do another interview and devised a series of questioning sequences to lead him to this own question, with the aim of leaving him with no way to tell more lies. After the crew's efforts, Robert agreed to the request for another interview, and when the crew came up with the latest evidence, Robert looked more and more nervous. At this point, the director of the title also looked nervous, his hands were shaking slightly. Then the crew turned off the camera and told Robert that the interview was over. However, the best part of what happened next was that although the crew turned off the camera, the microphone was still on Robert, and I don't know if the crew did it on purpose, or if they forgot to remind Robert to take the microphone off. Then Robert went to the bathroom once after the interview and everything was recorded, and he said this.
I'm having difficulty with the question. What the hell did I do? Kill them all. Of course.
On September 17, 2021, he was convicted in California of murdering journalist Susan Berman, a longtime friend. On October 14, 2021, a Los Angeles County Superior Court judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Robert died on January 10, 2022, at the age of 79 years. Prior to his death, he was awaiting trial on a new charge of murdering his wife. Robert, you know, I've had more money than I can spend in my life, and it hasn't brought me any joy.